release your back, you know, one vertebrae at a time, you know, into the floor, roll out nice and smooth and all this kind of thing. But the truth of it is we're asking people to do something that technically we have put them in a position where it's impossible to do that. Because you have to flex the spine to keep the legs from flopping and from falling over. So how can I tell you to completely release and completely relax and let your vertebrae roll out one vertebrae at a time when I put you in a position of mechanical disadvantage where it's actually impossible for you to do that? Now, what's interesting about the flow of the plow here, okay, is that you actually get to feel what that motion feels like without that antagonism. It feels kind of strange and different. It feels wobbly. Okay, it feels a little squirrely. It feels a little wobbly. It feels a little unsteady. Well, it's because there's not all the antagonism, all the control that's normally there, the tension on the spine that's normally there. That's why there's this little bit of motion like that. Why? Because there's not that tension on the spine that prohibits that motion when you do it on your own. All right? But now the beauty part about it is, if we did this a few times and he got used to the feeling of releasing into the posture versus controlling the posture, now he's starting to see himself as if he were more advanced than he actually is. I call it the Thai Yoga time machine. Right? Because I can take you into a posture that with less antagonism, maybe not completely free, because it actually takes, he doesn't trust me to not drop him. You know, even though he might intellectually, he might give me some permission, but really he doesn't trust me because we haven't done this enough so that it's actually intrinsic, this trust, okay? But if we did this a few times, he would. He'd realize I'm not going to drop him, and that he can actually kind of forget about me and just release into the posture. Now, as soon as that starts to happen, where he's focusing on his breath and on his release more than what's going on, now we're actually co-facilitating that posture. And that's a yin-yang thing that we're doing with the posture. I'm now the spine. See, I'm Mr. Spine. You don't have to be the spine anymore. You don't have to control anymore. You can actually allow for the motion. There's been some research into range of motion, stretching and so on, with mostly coming out of the American College of Orthopedic Surgeons and the American College of Sports Physicians. Okay, and basically one of the things that they came up with, and actually several years ago, this is not new. Okay, was the greatest impediment to range of motion had nothing to do with structure. Had nothing to do with structure. It was antagonistic muscle reflex. The greatest inhibition to doing any particular motion that's a natural range of motion. In other words, you're made to do that. It's not an unnatural position by any means of the imagination. The greatest inhibition to doing it is an antagonistic muscle reflex. And then there was a professor, Dr. Thomas Hanna, okay, Professor Hanna, and he said the reason why we have not so much facility over this antagonistic muscle reflex is because we have what he called sensory motor amnesia. Sensory motor amnesia. In other words, we've got all those vertebrae, right? And they're supposed to articulate individually, but they don't. They don't articulate individually. They articulate in groups. Okay? Now, if you're relatively healthy and your spine is healthy, okay, your groups will be smaller. So in other words, maybe 4 vertebrae will operate as a segment kind of thing. And you'll get a very little independent motion between them. And if you actually watch the spine of someone moving, you'll notice you have flat planes and there's a bridge. There's a point that bends, and then there's a section that doesn't, and then there's another place where it bends, and then there's a section that doesn't. Okay? And anytime you try and bring motion into one of those segments that are tight, it hurts. It's really resistant. And in fact, it may feel like it's wood. That's like, for example, I'll tell you that the one I notice the most is the atlas occiput. If you look on an x-ray or you look on a skeleton, that looks like a joint that should have the most motion in the cervical spine. Why? Because it's actually got a two-way rotation. It can go front and back, and it can rock from side to side. Okay? And it's actually designed to articulate like that. But in most people it doesn't. Not after age 30. See, by the time you get about 30 years old, it's starting to act as if it's one piece, and it's not. Okay? And so when we do, for example, an occipital release, when we do a bridge, and we go to release the occiput, most people, the first time I do that, it doesn't bend at all. It doesn't articulate at all. In fact, it acts like it's a piece of wood. It just sits there. Whatever. And if I were to tell you to let go and release it, you can't. Sensory motor amnesia. It means you've actually lost whatever it takes to be able to individualize a spinal segment and create motion or release there on an individual basis. You've lost that. We're now into the big picture. I can kind of focus on big parts of my spine. Okay? And also this is the mechanism where we get lots of strain injuries, because the tighter and bigger those segments get, the more they put strain on the segments that do move. And then that's where you're going to get the injury. It's why we get all these injuries in the low back, is because the four vertebrae above the low back have decided to act like they're one piece, which means it puts leverage, because now that's a handle, right? That's a lever. It puts that lever against a smaller area, so it gives it more force against the joint. Same thing with the neck. If the atlas stops articulating, well then that puts pressure on the other cervical vertebrae. And we're going to get, and then if we have a 5-mile-an-hour collision and we have a little whooplash, whooplash, okay, then we have an injury. Why? Because it should have been able to act like a spring, but it acted like a 2x4 and splintered instead of flexing. Okay? And it's too late to look for the flex when you get hit. It's too late. Okay? Now when we do the plow like this and we're rolling it out nice and gradually, what reason why it's uncomfortable is because you're not used to having smaller segments of motion in your spine. You're not used to it. What you want to do is kind of flop over and get to the next piece. You know, in other words, part like up here, maybe just below C7, maybe T1 through 3, you got a little mobility, so you kind of roll off your shoulders okay. But then we hit that section of vertebrae, that 5 or 6 vertebrae right between your shoulders, and you have lordosis, and you've lost spinal curvature there, and you've got some chronic spasm there, and it doesn't want to bow out at all, and so you kind of fall over to the bottom of your shoulders, and there's a little clunk as you go from the top of your shoulders to the bottom of your shoulders, and then at the bottom of your shoulders you've got a little more mobility. Okay, little more mobility. So, oh, now I'm rolling, yeah, but only for about 4 vertebrae. And then it's like, how do you get from there to the low back on the floor? And what do? You got to kind of fall over to that, and there's another clunk. And now your hips are down. Oh, now I can let my legs come over. And see, in this posture, we don't allow that to happen. We're really trying to speak to every vertebrae. Thomas Hanna said that sensory motor amnesia is actually an indication of atrophy, that it is actually a symptom of atrophy, and that it's on the roadmap to losing function completely. Okay? Because the first thing we do is we learn where the on and off switch is, and then the second thing is that joint has been compressed and tight and rigid so long that the body thinks that it's one piece. And so it says, well, since you're not articulating those vertebrae in the first place, you don't need the disc, because that's all the discs are for, is to facilitate articulation, okay, and act as a shock absorber. Well, you don't need that because you're not articulating and you're not absorbing shock. You're passing it on. And so then the discs start to deteriorate. The deterioration and compression of the disc triggers a calcification response because it's strain. And that's how your body knows where to pull calcium out of the blood supply, is by strain. Strain. For example, baseball pitcher's throwing arm. Have you done x-rays on athletes?
Of course.
Okay. What's the difference between the throwing arm and the non-throwing arm?
probably the throwing arm is more elongated and more flexible, possibly.
And as far as on the bias, how about bone density?
That should be denser.
It should be denser. It will be denser. Okay. In fact, ACSM did some X-rays. In fact, at one time, I think they did X-rays on every major pro baseball player. Okay, and they found out that a pro baseball player can have up to 50% more bone and greater bone density in their throwing arm than in their non-throwing arm. Okay. Another group that they checked out was soccer players, and they found out that their shins, that the shin bones in soccer players can have up to 50% greater bone density than ordinary people who don't get hit on their shins all day.
Wolf's Law.
Pardon me?
Wolf's Law.
Wolf's Law. It's based on stress. So in other words, as you stress and flex the periosteum, okay, it changes polarity. See, the periosteum has a crystalline lattice structure which creates a piezoelectric effect that when you bend the bone, it changes the polarity of the periosteum, switches polarity, which draws calcium out of the blood supply. Same thing when you break a bone, okay, the edges of the broken bone where the fracture is, or whether it's a spiral or slim or a major fracture, the actual edges of the bone actually change electrical polarity. That's how the body knows where the break is. That's how the body knows to form a blastoma there, which then becomes calcified, which is the mechanism for healing the broken bone. And then when it is annealed, okay, in other words, when the blastoma successfully anneals the ends of the bones together and the periosteum is restored, the polarity changes and it stops recruiting calcium. Now, when you have stress, adverse stress, let's say you wear high heel shoes too much. Stiletto, pointy-toed, 6-inch, you know what I'm talking about.
Hooker shoes.
Those kind of, the kind of F-word me shoes.
Yeah, I wasn't going to say that with
too
the
much,
too,
yeah,
but
too much. And you get calcification in the first toe, and you get bone spur in your toe and bone spur in your heel, okay? The reason that's there is because you have isolated your body weight to a small area, and the body is responding to that stress pressure by hauling calcium into it. The body says, well, if you're going to treat it like a bone, we're going to make it a bone. You want to talk about what's a bone spur? What's this process of adverse calcification? So you lose the function, the articulation of the spinal vertebrae through lack of use, okay? The discs start to compress. Something about the innate says, well, obviously you don't need 4 vertebrae there because you never use 4 vertebrae. You use all 4 stuck together like they're one. So let's just calcify them up and create some density there, and let's make them into one solid piece. And so you get all this calcification. You can see it on the X-ray. Okay? Now the interesting thing about it is, if it's not so advanced that there's still some motion possible, right? If you can divert the stress to another vertebral segment, okay, and get some motion, actually it will go the other way. See, not only can I recruit calcium into a bone by putting load-bearing stress on it, by removing the stress, I can decrease the bone density. All right? Where do those studies come from? NASA. NASA. The biggest problem, the biggest impediment of manned mission to Mars, even to the moon, but the biggest single impediment why we are not going to Mars at this time is because if we did go to Mars, by the time we got to Mars, we couldn't get out of the spaceship.
too long at zero gravity.
Because you would break your bones climbing down the stairs. Because you would have lost 60-70% of the bone mass in your body because of the lack of load-bearing stress. So, it's like, that's why I say things like we're stress-adaptive human biological transformational machines, is because everything's stressful. And we want to reduce our stress, but not completely. We want to reduce adverse harmful stress. We actually want to increase healthful stress. So see, yoga therapy is very stressful. But we say it's to relax you. In other words, and people will say, oh, I find it very relaxing. I'm like, well, it must not be very advanced. Okay? Because advanced yoga practice and advanced yoga therapy is very stressful. Why? Because what it does is it's like lightning. It follows the path of resistance. In other words, like a terrier dog going after a rat in a tunnel. Okay? I'm looking for the obstruction. I'm looking for the amnesia. I'm looking for the atrophy. I'm looking for the ischemia. I'm looking for the trigger points. I'm looking for the obstructions and resistance, because that's where I want to move in. Well, that's very stressful, but it's very good. And we call that therapy. Okay? But now, so when we're doing this posture on the receiving end, your job is to release and relax as much as possible. Because you have, right now, you have some atrophy and you have some SMA, sensory motor amnesia. The reason why your back is stuck, it's not freely articulating as you're being rolled in or out of this posture. Now, you may have some injury. Okay, now, please don't lose the common sense here. I'm not saying that if you actually have some scar tissue, you have some adhesions and some spinal lesions, maybe you even have some dysfusion. I don't know. There might be somebody in here who's already had a laminectomy and has some dysfusion, and maybe you have some rods, pins, screws, plates, etc. in your spine. I don't know, because no one's actually revealed to me that you have such things, but you might. Maybe you forgot.
Selective amnesia.
Yeah, no, you forgot. That, again, it's a function of amnesia. Is you don't remember that you forgot. Quite often, the only time I find it out is I'll be moving you around and the shirt will come up and I notice like a big old scar on the back. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, hey, what is that? Oh, yeah, I had the lower 4 vertebrae in my spine fused with bone out of my hip a couple of years ago. I said, well, don't you think that would have been helpful for me to know before we're doing all this spiny bendy stuff?
Yeah.
Don't you think? That could have, I forgot. I forgot.